Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I apologize for being late. It's good to see everyone this morning. So I think we're ready for the session. I want to introduce myself. I'm David Marquez. I am the Executive Director for Economic and Community Development in Bexar County, which is the county in which San Antonio sits. We are a rapidly growing city, and with all the big city challenges that you see around the world and around the country, here in the U.S. And so we're talking today about how we have approached the problem of homelessness and using mobile data and data analytics and AI to improve our interventions. So with that, we can start into the slide deck. Is it up on the screen already? There it is. So this is, we were, this past winter in San Antonio, we don't get a lot of cold weather, but when it comes, it comes into dangerously cold situation for the homeless. And given where they generally are rough sleeping, it can be a real challenge for the public system to intervene. This is a tunnel that goes underneath a major freeway here in San Antonio that my team and I went through as we were trying to provide blankets and other warm weather gear for the homeless population that doesn't care to go to a shelter for a variety of reasons or can't get to the shelter for any number of reasons. And so this really starts to become a problem for us. Let me talk a little bit about San Antonio. It is a metropolitan area of around 2.6 million people. Bexar County, where I work, is 2 million of that. And the city of San Antonio is about 1.5 million population. We're approximately an hour south of Austin. And that Austin-San Antonio corridor is rapidly growing. Our community is the second fastest growing community in the U.S. And so we have a lot of opportunity here, a lot of rapid growth. But as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of challenges in how we're facing with the problems that cities often have. Something else about San Antonio that I think lends itself to this audience and to our conversation, we are developing the reputation of Cyber City USA. Outside of the Washington, D.C. area, we have the second largest concentration of cyber professionals. We're home to the U.S. Air Force's Cyber Command, as well as a large cryptologic center for the NSA. And of course, that brings with it a variety of agencies and companies and other sorts of opportunities. The universities are very involved with providing that type of training. I will note also that the inaugural first ever in the U.S. in Cyber Forum, which will be held here in San Antonio a year from now, June 2025. And so that may be an opportunity for some of you to have a chance to look at coming to San Antonio to visit. We're home to 24 data centers. San Antonio, generally speaking, has very favorable weather, tectonically stable. Power is pretty abundant and inexpensive, so we're really attractive for data centers in addition to supporting the cybersecurity work. We have a very large presence of Microsoft data centers here and growing rapidly, as well as AWS and other smaller companies such as CyrusOne. So what about our homelessness population? This is a graphic representing the point-in-time count. The Department of Housing and Urban Development requires communities to undertake this point-in-time count on a single night of the year, every year, looking at both the sheltered population as well as the unsheltered population. And so in this graphic, you see the sheltered in the kind of teal color, the darker blue was the unsheltered population. And so what I take away from this graphic is it's really relatively stable. We haven't seen huge spikes. But it's clear to those of us in this space that this is it's undercounted by quite a bit for a range of reasons. But generally speaking, the community puts a tremendous amount of effort and money into providing services for the homeless to help them not to live on the street, to find ways off of the street, and if they are just not capable, then to provide permanent supportive housing or other shelter opportunities that fit their needs. One of the challenges you face when you're dealing with the homeless population is that by definition, they're homeless. They don't have an address. That makes them quite mobile. I happen to live right downtown, in fact, 3 blocks from this Greyhound bus station. and was sitting outside one day in front of the building on the sidewalk and was approached by a homeless individual who had just purchased a bus ticket. He had clearly had some mental deficits, but really wanted to get himself to the Washington, D.C. area. And he had a bus ticket, didn't have a real understanding of whether that ticket was going to get him there. And he did have a mobile phone on him, but unfortunately the battery was dead and he wasn't clear exactly where he could charge it. So he asked me to help him call the bus company, make sure that everything was squared away, which I did. But it became clear to me that this population really is mobile, both in and around the community, in and around Texas, and then even within states, between states. These are the folks who live in a variety of situations, various encampments around town. They may be living in shelters for the short term. Some of them live in their vehicles. Here in the U.S., that's a relatively common situation, and you'll often see, or I shouldn't say often, but you do see from time to time family living in a vehicle in front of a convenience store with children. So we really want to understand this mobility. When we're putting resources into providing services, this information is imperative for planning, for making sure that the services are effectively delivered and efficiently delivered, and most importantly, from my perspective, so that we can make improvements, continuous improvement, and making sure that whatever we are delivering is actually achieving the intended objective. But without our ability to see that the services we provided to a specific individual actually had some effect or not, that we really are always just treating every day as if it's a new day, and we don't have the ability to see trend data relative to this population because, again, of their mobility and their other challenges that we'll talk about in the next slide. So one challenge is in our community, there are dozens of agencies, both governmental, nonprofit, faith-based, and a range of other just well-intended individuals who will go out and interact with the homeless. And so it's difficult to aggregate the impact of any single program because, generally speaking, the population has a variety of actors who are intending to try to assist, either mitigate or eliminate or reduce the incidence of homelessness. Now, much of the data that is collected, and for those agencies that receive funding from Housing and Urban Development, they're required to put their information into what's called the Homeless Management Information System. And this is really an attempt to ensure that the homeless aren't bouncing from agency to agency. If they're, let's say, rejected or removed from a certain shelter, that they don't just make their way to another shelter and cause a problem unless that other shelter understands the reasons why they may have been put out or have left. And so HMIS is a good system, but it's largely self-reporting, and it doesn't really provide the kind of trend data that we would really want to see in order to provide improvement. I should say that in this approach, we're really not trying to necessarily act upon an individual. We're not trying to use this data in order to treat someone differently. But this data would be used to look at the system's performance, to be accountable to ourselves and to the funding sources that we have, that we are in fact delivering at the population level the sort of results that we intend to. So this is what makes the data that we collect here imperative. Again, this population has certain special characteristics. They're on the street, living rough, sleeping for a reason. Among those listed here, mental health, substance abuse, others. You also see individuals who, in our community, we have a large inflow of migrants from usually Latin America, Mexico, and beyond into Central and South America. And so they don't necessarily want to raise their hands for assistance because they're concerned about the possibility of being deported or otherwise facing consequences of that. In the U.S. as well, we have a system of registering those who have created or committed sex crimes. They'll wind up in a register as registered sex offenders. Very difficult for them to get housing or employment or educational opportunities. So living on the street, sometimes that's simply where they are, but for reasons that I think we can all understand, they don't necessarily want for folks to know who they are and where they've been and those kinds of things, because they're generally trying to fade back into the background, if you will. There may be other factors as well. So this data, to understand this population, is really imperative for our ability to do a better job of reducing the incidence of rough sleeping, of homelessness, as well as to improve the processes when someone is going to remain on the streets, that we're providing services to them in a way that meets their needs and is effective and efficient and not duplicative or other factors that may be driven without this information. So my colleague and I, Nick Venezia, who's on the call as well today, met. We happened to be talking one day in a cigar lounge when I was being asked to look at the homeless population in a suburban area. And my general thesis was that the homeless population in a suburban area might be different than the population that lives in the central city. This photograph I took in front of my apartment, this individual would come every day. There's a plug right to his right. You can't see it because he's not plugged in. Right next to my apartment is a Starbucks, which has Wi-Fi. And so he would sit there for 12 to 15 hours a day, watching videos and playing games on his phone, even though he's homeless. He would sleep somewhere else up the street, but this was his everyday office to come in and just sit. So we know that the homeless community has access to devices. Those are provided in the U.S. At free or low cost for individuals. Many of them are smartphones. When I looked up some of the data in the U.S., it's depending on who you ask, it's somewhere between 80 to 90%, and in the U.K. it's even higher. They generally, of course, are contract devices and using this public Wi-Fi, and they're always looking for that opportunity to connect to Wi-Fi as well as to charge their devices. Previously, there was an individual in front of my apartment who had a laptop and a tablet. I mean, he was there every day. He didn't speak English. He was from Latin America. I don't know exactly what he was doing, but a lot of gaming. But he seemed to be, doing other types of interaction online. And so this is a digital population today. In addition to those that don't have devices, of course, there are public libraries with PCs where they're logging in, creating a digital footprint for themselves with email addresses, et cetera, even though those types of devices that are stationary won't have apps or the ability for us to track them using mobile data, but they're still creating their profile and giving us the ability to start to understand who they are, where they are, and how long they've been on the streets, et cetera. So Nick and I in this conversation kind of developed a hypothesis that said some proportion of the people living in a large homeless shelter in our community, known as Haven for Hope, had mobile devices. And I asked him if he could figure a way to segregate the phones that were owned by the homeless versus those that were owned by staff or other volunteers that go to and from. And so Nick used this approach described on the screen here. I'm clearly not this expert in this area. That's Nick's role. But using an ad placed on phones at that location in order to use the ad impression on those apps that the devices were accessing. That would give us both the ability to ping the device, know where it was, as well as ensuring that we had opt-in verification. We certainly want to be mindful of individuals' privacy and need for their own security. And so that created this opportunity to collect those devices. That was then filtered to create a unique event ID so that we could anonymize the devices. And now we're just looking at a population of devices that are owned by homeless individuals, but not identifiable at the individual level. So from there, you use a approach of just looking to see which devices are moving to and from the shelter to determine which ones are staff or other volunteers. And from that, we determined that about 268 devices were owned by staff. It's a very large homeless organization. Of course, it's 24/7, so they have a fair amount of staff. And we looked at this over the course of a week. So I called the director of the program and I asked her, hey, Kim, how many people do you have working? What's your current headcount at Haven for Hope? And she said, well, we have a few vacancies, but it's about 273. So a very accurate way of discerning which devices were being held by staff and which ones were being held by homeless, but without having to ask, without having to approach those individuals, without having to rely on that kind of self-reporting, if you will. So that made it very uh, accurate and reliable, gave me a real sense of confidence that we could use this data at the population level to really start to see the patterns, which we'll show you in the next slide. The other dimension of this approach is to knowing that the population has its own devices at a 80 or 90% level. It seems to be a pretty good proxy for the total population, meaning there may be only 5 to 10 to 15, maybe 20% of individuals who don't have a device, but that still would give us a high degree of confidence based on those that do have a device. Although I recognize that one could hypothesize that those without the devices are perhaps the more difficult to reach for any of the number of reasons that we mentioned above, meaning that maybe the more difficult population because they can't hang on to a device because of mental challenges or substance abuse challenges. So they're not very good at keeping up with their device. But in any event, that would be a subset of the population, relatively small. We could still do quite a bit of evaluation of ourselves just using the population that did have a device. So in this slide, a colleague of ours, James Macion, used Tableau to take the data and looking backwards from this population, we then asked the question, where did they come from? So it's often perceived in the homeless population that other communities are contributing their homeless to our community. And I guess in reality, we may be contributing our homeless to other communities as well. But we wanted to see where those devices were looking back a week to see where that device's unique identifier was. And so looking back to see where that device was last located before it came to San Antonio, trying to understand and prove or disprove this theory that most of them come from out of town. We happened to run into the mayor of San Antonio, who's a friend and a colleague, of course, and asked him, where do you think the homeless come from that arrive in San Antonio? And his immediate answer was, well, it's Los Angeles, right? California having such a large homeless population, they're clearly shedding more people to our community. But this data would say that that's not the case at all. In fact, most of the homeless population seems to travel up and down the interstate that goes north and south through San Antonio. It actually goes to the border of Mexico and beyond into Mexico at Laredo and winds up at the Canadian border, I believe in Minnesota. So it's a very robust passageway of people, cargo, trucks, buses, many major cities along that road, including Austin, Dallas, Oklahoma City, and beyond. So it perhaps doesn't surprise that they use that kind of as a river, right? Transporting themselves north and south, perhaps based on weather, moving north when it's hot in San Antonio and down south when it's cold in the north. So the data would show us that of the 3,435 individuals that were part of the population, they were coming from Oklahoma primarily, some from Georgia, some from Louisiana, but very few from California. So this opens the possibility, especially if we look at cities, as you can see in the top 10 origin cities below, that Austin is a primary contributor of homeless, that there may be some level of circularity between the two communities, which might argue that if we're trying to serve an individual or a population of individuals, that we may need a kind of two-city strategy, meaning to sustain the same level of intervention for substance abuse or whatever the issue may be, that we need more collaboration. And this data would allow us to see whether or not we're breaking the cycle of circularity, whether or not the services are having a different effect when we treat them with a common intervention between the two cities versus those that we're treating with individual approaches depending on what happens in Austin or Dallas versus San Antonio. So this really opens the door for us to look at our interventions in a different way, a much higher degree of accountability for ourselves and for all the various agencies that interact, because most of the agencies, well, I should say all, are interested in knowing whether they're effective. They just don't have the means. It's exceptionally difficult if you're using just a standard interview approach with data collection, et cetera. But this approach at least allows us to begin to look at the individual through their digital presence, and going from there, looking at other factors. This next slide takes that same population. Then the question was, are these individuals going to and from our hospitals? No secret that this population generally uses emergency rooms for their primary care, and because of the nature of their life situation, are often in the ER for emergency services. And so this becomes a real challenge for hospitals, primarily around the area of uncompensated care. And again, they're using data. They can clearly have an interview with the individual as they arrive at the hospital. Perhaps they can sort of discern that the individual is homeless or rough sleeping. But this would really allow us to not only see that they're homeless at the event when they arrive in the ER, but how many times they went to the hospital. Are they going to different hospitals? Those that are perhaps trying to gain prescriptions to drugs through their medical condition that might need to be controlled, might be bouncing between hospitals in order to try to gain access and get a prescription filled for themselves. So this, again, is the kind of data that's been discussed for many, many years, but this approach using the mobile device data allows us to really understand it so that we can improve our performance, provide that better service, and prevent any kind of misuse of the system as it's designed. So as we use this data, we would expect our ability to improve the overall performance using data, not just anecdotal information about an individual who got off the street, or using self-reported data, which is prone to a variety of challenges and problems, but using the actual data that would allow us to look over time at the trends of this population. So we see the ability for agencies like mine and all the other myriad agencies that we interact with to really delve into this data and use it for good for ourselves. The other thing that we know about these devices is that the individual can have a positive impact. So for all the same ways that Amazon or others interact with me, trying to convince me to make that purchase or take that vacation or whatever it may be, the devices could be used in such a similar way for the population that we're serving, knowing that they are a discrete population with a discrete set of opportunities, if you will. In some respects, you could almost view it as a real estate play. You know, each of these individual intersections where they tend to congregate represent a kind of real estate opportunity that might allow us to gain a different approach to tracking and managing that population so that we can improve outcomes. But for themselves, the devices represent an opportunity. For the things that you see listed on the screen. It's virtually impossible now to get housing or job searching without some sort of digital device. And so we are encouraging that the devices spread further for, again, the online treatment of their mental health issues, et cetera. But the one I wanted to highlight is this public and life safety issue, which I mentioned at the beginning of the slides. So San Antonio generally has very favorable weather, but we are in flash flood alley. Now we're a little far south on the tornado alley of the Oklahoma, Dallas, and north. So we don't get a lot of tornadoes and we don't get a lot of rain, but when it comes, it tends to come all at once. So you can see on the right side of the screen, some members of my team out heading into a freeze event in early January, giving this individual some blankets and other cold weather gear, gloves and earmuffs, etc. And you can see she's lighting the page that we were handing her with information about the shelters with her mobile phone flashlight. This is an individual living in a conduit under a freeway with a mobile device, who's just making her way in life, and she seems to be a bit elderly. Don't know anything about her circumstances, but we could see using the device itself to try to gain more insight that might help us with her. But on the left side of the screen, a week later, we got a flash flood, sort of unexpected. It's a little unusual in that time of year in January, and that particular conduit was flooded. Now, this story about people being swept away is not from this particular area, but from a different flood zone where homeless tend to congregate. So, could we use this device information to help us plan for the homeless and taking care of their needs when there's a natural disaster coming or other factor that we'd want to inform them, recognizing that they have specific challenges in their ability to move or not move from the area where they are, but at least we could do a better job of notifying them using their devices, especially if we knew they were a discrete population. I will point out that some of the kind of commercial tracking systems for mobile device data generally struggle with this population because they don't live in a residence. In other words, this device spends the night in a place that isn't a home or an apartment. It spends the night on a road or under a bridge. And so it can be difficult unless you're specifically intending to isolate this population to figure that out. So again, as we're moving towards the end here, this would allow us to get an accurate count, find those ad hoc encampments as they pop up, and then provide those warning messages. Of course, COVID-19, thank God, is behind us. But living downtown during that time, I can tell you this population was really struggling. All of their restrooms that they might use at a convenience store or a pharmacy were closed. All of the charging opportunities were closed. And so there was not a way to give them any information early on. There was also a perception that given the nature of the population, they might be quite vulnerable to and infectious with COVID-19. So it took a while for the city to ramp up their efforts, but using the devices might give us a better way of identifying them and providing them with targeted information. So can we use this sort of AdTech to do good for the homeless population? These are the things we would expect to see as outcomes. And so we're pretty excited to move forward with this effort, and would love to report back in the future as we start to make actual process improvements around this data. Thank you very much.
So David, I hope you can hear me. Do we have any questions?
Let me turn.
Yeah, we've got time for one quick question, if there is one from the audience. No? Okay. Well, listen, David, I'm going to...
Tim,
yeah?
Can you point out, we don't have time for it now. We don't have time for it now, but can you make mention to, he's got an online demo that people can get later that we can email. So if they email me, I can make sure they get access to that and they can play with the Tableau experience that he showed.
Okay, there's a question from Andrew behind you, yeah?
Thank you very much. Can you just confirm the protection of the privacy of the individual? Is this a fully consented, opted-in access to location data, or is it something that requires the user the subject to opt out if they don't want it?
So they are opted in by virtue of the same consent that they give in signing up for the various apps and devices that are used. So we do recognize that there's a higher need for privacy. Again, I mentioned some of these individuals have reasons why they don't want to be identified or located. And so the anonymization happens immediately after that. I'm not the expert on that space, but I do have the same concerns that you do. And so Nick, as I mentioned, who wasn't able to join, has provided that level of anonymization and privacy and consent assurance. I wish I were the technical expert to tell you all of the specifics, but we can provide that for you as well when we give the link.
I'm not sure if you heard Michael's question earlier, but I believe you have an online demo, and if you could just give us some details of how the audience can access that.
Yeah, there was a QR code on the slides that had those Tableau screen caps, but we can provide that for you as well. But that QR code will take you to that Tableau page.
Okay. Thanks very much for joining us, David. Great insights. Thank you very much.
Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.